Welcome to Book Talk. Gentlemen of England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here. The immortal words of Shakespeare's King Hal, rallying his troops before a legendary victory, the Battle of Agincourt. It was one of the great moments in the 100 Years' War, the long conflict between England and France. And close to its 600th anniversary, I'm talking to the author of an epic history of that epic war, Jonathan Sumption. And Jonathan, viewed from the perspective of history rather than from the stage of a Shakespearean play, the Battle of Agincourt wasn't the great decisive moment it probably seemed at the time.
No, it wasn't. The 100 Years' War is the great demonstration of the fact that you can win all the battles and lose the whole war. And the Battle of Agincourt militarily resolved absolutely nothing except that it enabled Henry V and his army to scuttle back home to England for the next 2 years. But politically, it made an enormous difference, and the secret is that it completely transformed the politics of France and exposed weaknesses which Henry V was able to exploit 2 years later when he invaded France for the second time.
Now, this is the fourth volume in a history that you're continuing to write. I gather you've just started on volume 5, and it's called The Cursed Kings. So what were the curses on the kings?
Well, the most cursed king of all was Charles VI of France. At the time of the Battle of Agincourt, Charles VI had been intermittently mad for about half of his 46 years. And his madness led to his closest relatives fighting each other to fill the void left by the absence of anybody who was ultimately in control. And it was the weaknesses generated by the civil wars of France, themselves the result of Charles VI's madness, which really gave the English their opportunity. But there were others as well, notably the King of Scotland. We forget sometimes that Scotland was a participant in these wars as an ally of France. And the King of Scotland passed many years as a prisoner in England from his 12th birthday. Henry V himself died of dysentery, aged only 36, just 6 weeks before he would have become King of France. So it was a time of multiple misfortunes for all the principal actors involved.
Because one of the things you don't get from Shakespeare's history plays, which I suppose are the main medium by which an English audience probably knows anything at all about the 100 Years' War, the thing you don't get is the sense of quite how wrecked France had become by internal dissension. At the time, you have great dukes having each other murdered in the streets, you have vast armies careering across the landscape, pillaging and destroying the agriculture as they went.
Yes, that's the remarkable thing about Shakespeare. Shakespeare was writing a patriotic piece in which the moral was that superior virtue and endurance prevailed. The French hardly come into it except as boastful braggarts whose job it is subsequently to meet their condign fate. It's the classic opposition of nemesis and hubris. And that's a great theme on both stage and screen, and Shakespeare was selling that story. But of course, Shakespeare tells us nothing about the madness of the king. On the contrary, Charles VI appears as a wise old bird trying to restrain the over-enthusiasm of his son, the Dauphin. He tells us nothing about the murder of the Duke of Orleans 8 years before the Battle of Agincourt, which propelled France into a vicious civil war that lasted for decades. He tells us nothing about any of the great crises of France. Indeed, the most extraordinary thing is that Shakespeare moves straight from the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which was the treaty by which Henry V was made heir to the King of France and promised the kingdom after the current king's death. Now, anyone would think, reading Shakespeare, that the Treaty of Troyes was the consequence of the Battle of Agincourt. Not at all. He's missed out famous and dramatic events. He's missed out the second invasion by Henry V of France. He's missed out the murder of the Duke of Burgundy on the bridge of Montereau, lured to a peace conference only to be hacked to death in a carefully planned operation. That was the event that really enabled Henry V to achieve what he did.
That was essentially because there was no prospect whatsoever of the various factions within France uniting against the English anymore after that.
Neither of them was powerful enough on their own to defeat the English army. Both of them together might have done, but they hated each other more than they hated the English.
Let's talk a little bit about King Hal himself. It seems to me that we don't actually know anything very much directly about him. There's no sort of sense that you seem to get from the historical sources of what kind of a man he was.
Yes, that is broadly true. The broad position about medieval kings is that failures are better and more intimately recorded than successes. So we know a great deal about the personality of Edward II and Richard II, for example, both of whom were misfits and failures and ended up being deposed and murdered. But we know much less about the hero kings, people like Edward III and Henry V. And the reason is that veneration, adulation, creates a mask in front of people's faces, and it's very difficult, particularly when you're dealing with medieval sources, to penetrate behind that mask. What we do know about Henry V's public personality, which was probably at least partly contrived by him for political reasons, is that he was rather prim, rather priggish, very pious. Now, these are not qualities that immediately commend themselves to 21st century audiences.
Well, the Shakespearean Henry V was a bit of a roisterer in his day.
Well, only in Henry IV. In the plays on Henry IV, he was. And there's some controversy about whether there's any factual basis for the view of Henry V as prince as being a bit of a roisterer. My own view is that there was something in it. We just don't know how much.
What we do know about him, though, is that when he does succeed as the heir to what wasn't a monarchy of rather dubious legitimacy, his father having had King Richard II killed and taken over in effectively a coup, he got a grip on the country with remarkable rapidity, sorted its finances, dealt with various internal crises, and was ready to attack France.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. And in a sense, the attack on France was part of that. To some extent, it was an opportunistic attempt to take advantage of the serious crisis of affairs in France.
A smash and grab raid, you might say.
Well, it was grabbing too much for it to be characterized just in that way. But I think it was also an attempt to establish the legitimacy of his dynasty. Henry IV had faced a number of rebellions, some of them very serious. Henry V faced some rebellions in the first 2 years of his reign. After Agincourt, his legitimacy was absolutely unquestioned. God had spoken.
And one of the interesting things about Agincourt was the slightly bizarre circumstances in which he won. His army had invaded France. He'd taken, after a long and rather gruelling siege, the city of Harfleur, but lost half his army, mostly to disease in the process. And then he immediately starts marching across country with what's left of his army in a position which must have made him incredibly vulnerable to what was bound to be a larger French force. Why on earth did he do it?
Well, that is a very interesting question. And to my mind, it casts doubt on the quality of his generalship. He had, as you say, lost a large part of his army, mainly to disease, outside Harfleur. And he marched across northern France with something like half of the men that he had brought with him from England. He did it, I think, because he needed to keep his end up. He didn't want to be seen scuttling back to England, re-embarking straight after the siege and going away again. He wanted to show that he was a power to be reckoned with, and therefore he wanted a show of force. But I don't think he wanted a battle. What he hoped was to outmarch the French and get to Calais before they could concentrate their forces against him. And he was outmaneuvered. The French very skillfully blocked his passage of the Somme, which is the river that lies across the route to Paris, to Calais, sorry. And they forced him to battle in circumstances where he was at a very big numerical disadvantage, where his troops were completely exhausted, whereas the French ones were much fresher, where his supplies had run out, where the French were still getting supplies. That was a huge risk, which I don't think that a better general would in fact have taken.
But it ended all right in the end.
It ended all right because the French made a catastrophic mistake. They chose a site for the battle which was designed to prevent Henry V from getting away. They didn't want him to escape them. So they blocked his route to Calais at the head of what amounted to a broad defile with dense forest to the right and the left, so that he wouldn't be able to escape. The problem about that was that because it forced both armies into a narrow front, it prevented the French from making use of their superior numbers. They couldn't outflank the English army and go round the side, which is what you would normally do if you had an army more than twice the size of your enemy, because of the forest. So the English had their flanks firmly protected by the forest. The French were crammed into a small space which got narrower as they approached the English lines. And the result was that they were so tightly crammed together that the men in the front couldn't even raise their weapons to strike, and they were shortly crushed by the ongoing pressure of the ranks behind them, trying to get at the enemy. Most French troops who died in the battle, and their casualties were horrendous, were probably smothered under the pile of their own men.
But that broke the power of the French crown right there, didn't it?
It broke the power of the French army, but armies recover, and France was a populous country. If it hadn't been for the political consequences of the battle, the effect that it had on the French Civil War, they would have got over it. It was the political consequences that really made the difference.
As you said, in tracing the errors in Shakespeare's chronology and all this, this didn't immediately lead to a political settlement which made Henry the heir of France. He had to fight on for another 5 odd years to achieve that.
What made him the heir of France was the fact that the Dauphin murdered the Duke of Burgundy, or he got his henchmen to murder the Duke of Burgundy on the bridge of Montereau. He would never have achieved what he had done if the Dauphin had not made a really catastrophic political misjudgment. He was warned by his wiser councillors that this would be the consequence, but he was a young man, and his other advisors were foolhardy but experienced, and he accepted their advice. It cost him another 16 years of civil war.
There was therefore this political deal between Henry and the French monarchy, part of which was that Henry married King Charles VI's daughter Catherine.
Yes.
And the interesting, this is almost a medical question really, is that their son, Henry's successor, who of course took over at a very, didn't take over, who ascended to the throne at a very young age when Henry died, had the same kind of, or what seemed to be the same kind of mental ailments.
Yes,
as
less
Charles
persistent and less serious in his case, but you're absolutely right. And the trouble is, diagnosis is difficult enough at the time. It's very difficult indeed across 6 centuries, especially when the symptoms are not described with the exactness that you would nowadays expect.
So we can only speculate.
We can only speculate. But the possibility of a genetic connection between the illnesses of Henry VI and Charles VI is obviously a very real one. And it goes back further than that. I mean, there had been a history of mental disease among particularly the women in the Valois dynasty of France for some generations. Charles V's wife, for example, had possibly not the same illness, but serious psychological problems.
And I suppose what this tells us, in a way, both in what had happened in France and the events which you haven't yet chronicled, and what subsequently happened in England as a result of having a king who's occasionally intermittently paralysed by mental illness, is to tell you the disaster of not having firm control in a country of that kind. What happens when internal dissension takes in?
It's not a democracy, it's a monarchy. And it's a monarchy which is highly centralised, very organised, and the disappearance of the ultimate source of authority is a political catastrophe. In circumstances where there's nobody actually in charge, you have 2 groups of people basically trying to divert the riches of the crown into their own pocket. It's tax revenues, it's treasury, the king's jewels, everything. It was really a row about assets, about money. Both the Duke of Orleans and the Duke of Burgundy, the main antagonists in this conflict, both of them needed the money to finance their very ambitious schemes for enlarging their power in France and to some extent outside France as well.
And very neatly that brings us on to your next volume, which will doubtless chronicle similar events unfolding in England as Henry IV's reign dissolved into chaos for pretty similar reasons, I suppose. When can we look forward to that? It's taken you 25 years to get this far.
Well, I'm sorry about that. There it is. It takes time. And I hope I will finish the 5th volume in 6 or 8 years, which is about the time it's taken for me to do each of the other ones. But I do have a day job. and that has to have priority.
Indeed. Well, you timed this one very nicely to get for the 600th anniversary of Agincourt. Jonathan Sumption, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on Book Talk.
Thank you.
And Book Talk will be back again next week. Do join us then.